There is a version of you that you have never met. Not because it doesn't exist, but because you have been too busy performing the version you think everyone needs to see. You built this performance so long ago that you forgot it is a performance. And here is the uncomfortable part. The life you call yours right now, the relationships, the anxiety, the repetition, the feeling that something is always slightly off, is not happening to you like weather happens to a field. You are architecting it, every single day, with every choice you refuse to examine. Otto spent his life studying one particular human terror, not the fear of death, and not the fear of failure, but something deeper. The fear of actually being yourself. He called it the will conflict. On one side, the pull toward individual expression, toward becoming something real and distinct. On the other side, the gravitational force of dissolution, the need to merge, to conform, to disappear into the crowd and call it belonging. Most people never resolve this conflict. They just find increasingly sophisticated ways to avoid feeling it. And what does unresolved conflict look like from the outside? It looks like your life. It looks like the patterns you keep explaining away. It looks like the story you've been telling yourself about why things are the way they are. This video will not comfort you. It will not give you a system or 3 morning habits or a list of affirmations. What it will do, if you stay with it, is show you the exact mechanisms by which you are constructing the experience you call reality. Not metaphorically, literally. The walls of your world were built by your hands. And the only question worth asking now is whether you had the courage to build them, or whether fear was the architect. Topic 1. The life you did not choose. You did not choose most of the things that define you. You did not choose your first language. You did not choose the emotional atmosphere of the house you grew up in. You did not choose whether love felt safe or conditional or absent. You did not choose the values that were pressed into you before you had the cognitive capacity to evaluate them. And yet, all of those unchosen things are now you. They are the lens through which you interpret every interaction, the filter through which every new experience passes before you decide what it means. Chuta, here is the question that matters. At what point did you stop receiving a self and start building one? Because there is a line. For most people, it happens somewhere in adolescence, when the dissonance between who they are and who they are expected to be becomes too sharp to ignore. And at that moment, a choice gets made, often unconsciously, about which direction to collapse in, either toward the self or away from it. Rank called this the neurotic compromise. The person who cannot fully submit to social expectation because something in them resists, but also cannot fully commit to individual expression because something in them is terrified. So they do both incompletely. They rebel just enough to feel alive. They conform just enough to feel safe. And they spend the rest of their lives in this narrow, exhausting corridor between authentic existence and social performance. You know this corridor. You have been walking it for years. Every time you almost said the true thing but softened it at the last second. Every time you agreed with something you didn't believe because the silence would have been too loud. Every time you chose the familiar suffering over the unknown freedom, because at least suffering has a shape you recognize. The problem is not that you made these compromises. The problem is that you stopped noticing you were making them. They became invisible. They became you. And now when someone asks what you want, what you actually, genuinely want, you hesitate. Not because you don't know, but because that question has started to feel dangerous. that hesitation. That is not confusion. That is the gap between the life you are living and the life that is actually yours to live. And it is not comfortable to stand in that gap and look around. Topic 2. The approval architecture. Let's name something most people would rather not look at directly. You have organized your entire personality around managing other people's perception of you. Not just the way you dress or the way you speak, but something much deeper. The subjects you avoid, the emotions you never display in public, the versions of yourself you keep in separate rooms and never allow to meet each other. You have become an expert at knowing, within seconds of entering a room, what this particular audience requires from you. And then you deliver it, effortlessly, automatically, without even noticing. This is not weakness. This is survival intelligence. As a child, reading the emotional environment and adjusting accordingly was probably necessary. It kept the peace. It protected you. The problem is that this skill, which was adaptive at 7 years old, has now become a prison. Because it never turned off. It scaled with you. And now you are an adult doing the same calibration, scanning every room, every relationship, every conversation for the signal that tells you whether you are safe or not. Safe being defined as approved of. Think about the last time you said something you genuinely believed, knowing it would create friction. Did you say it fully? Or did you watch yourself pre-edit it in real time, trimming the edges, softening the intensity, adding qualifiers that diluted the actual thought? You know you do this. What you may not have examined is the cost. See, every time you dilute yourself for approval, you send a message to your own nervous system. The message is this: your authentic expression is dangerous. Over time, the body learns this lesson. The authentic impulse starts generating anxiety before it even surfaces. You start to feel uncomfortable with your own thoughts before you've said them to anyone. You become your own censor. You don't need external disapproval anymore. You've internalized it so thoroughly that you disapprove of yourself preemptively. And here is the cruelest part of this architecture. It never actually delivers what it promises. Approval is not cumulative. Getting it today does not make you feel secure tomorrow. You have to earn it again and again, in every room, with every person, and somehow the debt never gets paid off. Because the need was never really about them. It was always about that original wound, the one that taught you that love is conditional, that presence must be earned, that who you actually are is not quite enough. Rank's insight cuts here like a knife. The desire for approval is not social anxiety. It is thanatophobia. It is the fear that if you are truly seen, if you let the full, unedited version of yourself be visible, you will be rejected in a way so total and final that it will feel like annihilation. You equate disapproval with death, not consciously, but in the body, in the chest, in the way your voice changes when you sense tension in the room. Topic 3. The mask you forgot you were wearing. There is a specific phenomenon in psychology known as the persona, the constructed face we present to the world. But here is what rarely gets discussed: the moment when the persona becomes indistinguishable from the self. It begins gradually. You adopt certain behaviors because they get results. You learn that competence is valued, so you perform competence even when you feel lost. You learn that stability is admired, so you perform stability even when you are disintegrating inside. You learn that enthusiasm is rewarded, so you perform enthusiasm even when you are hollow. None of these performances are dishonest in the beginning. They are aspirational. They are who you want to be. But then something shifts. The performance becomes habitual. And habituation is just another word for invisibility. The thing happens so regularly that you stop perceiving it as a thing happening. You stop feeling the effort. And what you stop feeling, you start mistaking for reality. Ask yourself right now, is there a gap between the person you present at work and the person you are alone at midnight? Is there a gap between the emotional range you display to your closest relationships and the emotional range you actually experience? If the answer is yes, which it almost certainly is, then the question is not whether you wear a mask. The question is how thick it has become. Because masks have a weight. They are metabolically expensive. The energy required to maintain a consistent performance across years and decades, to remember which version of yourself is appropriate for which context, to police your authentic responses before they can surface. This is not theoretical burden. It shows up in your body. It shows up in the fatigue you feel on Sunday evenings without knowing why. It shows up in the strange irritation that rises when someone asks how you really are. It shows up in the relief you feel when you're alone. Not because you like isolation, but because you can finally stop performing. Rank argued that the neurotic is not someone who suffers more than others. The neurotic is someone who is more honest with themselves about what the performance costs. Everyone pays. The neurotic refuses to pretend otherwise. And that refusal, that inability to simply numb out and call the mask a face, is actually the beginning of something real. Topic 4. Anxiety is not your enemy. Stop treating anxiety like a malfunction. The culture you live in has decided that anxiety is a problem to be solved, a symptom to be medicated, managed, eliminated. And so you have spent considerable energy trying to make your anxiety go away. Through control, through avoidance, through optimizing your environment to the point where nothing unexpected can reach you. And yet it persists, not because your management techniques are insufficient, but because anxiety is not a bug. It is a signal. Rank made a distinction that very few people sit with long enough to absorb. There is neurotic anxiety, and there is existential anxiety. Neurotic anxiety is the fear of living your actual life, the avoidance of growth, of change, of the confrontation with who you actually are. Existential anxiety is something else entirely. It is the anxiety that arises precisely when you are close to the truth, when you are near a decision that actually matters, when you are about to say the real thing. So step toward the real path. Be the real person. Most people cannot tell the difference. They feel anxious and immediately move toward resolution, toward the familiar, the safe, the already known. What they don't realize is that sometimes the anxiety is telling them to keep moving, not to stop. That the discomfort is not a warning to retreat. It is the friction of becoming. Think about a moment when you were genuinely alive. Not comfortable, not safe, alive. There was probably anxiety in it. There was probably uncertainty. There was probably the feeling that you were in territory you hadn't mapped yet. That feeling, the one you have been taught to eliminate, is what it feels like to be at your actual edge. Not the performed edge, where you do risky-looking things in a controlled way to signal courage. The real edge. The place where the outcome is not guaranteed, and the person who will emerge from it is not yet known. The question is not how to feel less anxious. The question is whether you have developed the capacity to be anxious and act anyway, to tolerate the signal long enough to hear what it's actually saying. Because when you rush past anxiety, when you anesthetize it or explain it away, you are not solving a problem, you are refusing a message. And messages that are refused do not disappear. They find other channels. Topic 5. The stories you keep telling. You are the narrator of your own life. You know this intellectually. What you may not have fully absorbed is what that means. It means that the story you tell about why you are the way you are is not a passive observation. It is a creative act. Might every time you say, "I am this way because of that experience," or "I can't do that because of who I am," or "this always happens to me," you are not reporting reality. You are constructing it. The narrative is not the description of the pattern. The narrative is the pattern. Here is a specific example. You probably have a story about intimacy, about how much closeness you can tolerate before you start to feel unsafe, about how vulnerable you allow yourself to be before the wall comes back up, about what kinds of love you deserve and what kinds will inevitably disappear. This story feels like insight. It feels like self-awareness. But ask yourself, when did you last test it? When did you last approach an intimate situation without the story already loaded and ready? Because here is what stories do. They are not just descriptions of the past. They are instructions for the future. When you carry a story that says people leave eventually, you do not simply experience that outcome passively. You participate in creating it. You test for evidence of departure in every relationship. You interpret ambiguity as confirmation. You pull back first, just enough to make the leaving make sense. And then when the person leaves, or when you leave, which amounts to the same thing, the story absorbs the information and becomes more solid, more real, more inevitable. Rank's framework here is precise. The life we construct is always in service of the story we have chosen about what kind of creature we are. The person who believes they are unworthy of real success will construct a life that confirms this, not through failure, but through carefully maintained mediocrity. The person who believes intimacy is dangerous will construct a life of partial connections, never getting close enough to be truly known. The story runs the architecture. You experience the architecture and call it fate. Topic 6. The will that you abandoned. Rank's most radical idea was this: the individual will, the capacity to want something distinct, to choose a direction that is genuinely yours rather than assigned to you, is not just a psychological asset. It is the central fact of human existence. And the degree to which you have surrendered it, suppressed it, or apologized for it determines almost everything about the quality of your life. When did you last want something without immediately assessing whether wanting it was appropriate, without calculating the response of others, without hedging the desire with reasons why it was probably too much, too unrealistic, too revealing of something embarrassing about your character? Most adults have developed a sophisticated protocol for neutralizing desire before it becomes visible. The desire arises, genuinely, specifically, with texture and direction. And then, within seconds, the protocol engages. The desire gets checked against. What will this say about me? Is this allowed in the context of who I am supposed to be? What does this want reveal that I am not ready to have revealed? And if the desire fails the screening, if it is too naked or too large or too much at odds with the performed self, it gets rerouted. You tell yourself you don't really want it, or you do want it, but it's not practical, or you might want it later in a safer moment, when the conditions are better. The conditions are never better. That is not a pessimistic statement. It is an observation about what waiting for better conditions is actually doing. It is the strategy of a will that has been taught to defer, to minimize itself, to treat its own desires as presumptuous until proven otherwise. Here is the cost you are not calculating. You are not just losing the things you want. You are losing the practice of wanting. The more consistently you override your genuine desire in favor of the acceptable substitute, the more difficult it becomes to locate what you actually want. The signal degrades. You arrive at a point, and many people arrive here, where you genuinely do not know what you want from your life. Not because you are empty, but because the channel between authentic desire and conscious awareness has been blocked for so long that you cannot access it cleanly anymore. That is not a small loss. That is the loss of your primary navigational instrument. Topic 7. The void you are running from. There is a particular kind of emptiness that most people spend enormous energy avoiding. Not depression. Depression has a texture, a weight, a specific quality of suffering that at least signals something. This is something quieter than depression. More neutral. More terrifying precisely because of its neutrality. You encounter it at odd moments. On a Sunday afternoon when there's nothing that needs to be done. In the pause between finishing one task and starting the next. In the quiet after a social event. When the stimulation has ended and you are alone with whatever is actually there. In that pause, before you reach for the phone or the television or the errand you invented, there is a moment of encounter. A moment where you are right up against something that doesn't have a name. Most people move past this moment so quickly that they barely register it. They fill the pause. They have become experts at filling pauses. Their entire lifestyle, the busyness, the noise, the scheduling, the constant optimization, is partially a strategy for not being alone with the pause. Because the pause contains a question that, once heard clearly, cannot be unheard. Rank would say the void is not actually emptiness. It is unstructured possibility. It is the experience of standing at the boundary of your constructed self and sensing the largeness of what exists beyond it. Most animals don't have this problem. They do not have the cognitive capacity to know that they are finite and that their life is a specific shape rather than the only possible shape. Humans have this capacity, and it generates a specific kind of terror. The terror of recognizing that you could have been otherwise. That the life you are living is one of an enormous number of possible lives. That the self you have constructed is constructed, not given. This recognition, if you don't immediately numb it, is the beginning of something enormously important. It is the moment when the constructed self becomes visible as constructed. When the story becomes legible as a story. When the persona is experienced as a persona. And in that moment, a question becomes possible that was not possible before. What would I choose if I were actually choosing? Not what would I choose to avoid the void. Not what would I choose to maintain the structure that keeps me comfortable. Not what would I choose to continue being legible to the people whose opinion matters to me. What would I choose if I were choosing from the deepest, most undefended part of myself? Most people never ask this question directly. They have too much invested in not hearing the answer. Topic 8. The courage that is never convenient. Rank's concept of the creative will, the artist's will, as he sometimes called it, was not about artistic output. It was about a particular relationship to existence. The person who lives creatively, in Rank's sense, is not someone who makes paintings. It is someone who has accepted the terrifying freedom of self-creation, who has looked at the fact of their own finitude and decided, in full awareness of that finitude, to invest fully in the life they are living. This is not inspirational. It is not comfortable. Because accepting the creative will means accepting responsibility for your life in a way that is far more total than the culture generally asks you to accept. It means no longer being able to locate the source of your dissatisfaction outside yourself. It means no longer being able to say, "I would be different if my circumstances were different," with full conviction. It means confronting the fact that at every moment you are choosing not just the obvious choices, but the subtle ones. The choice to believe the story, the choice to maintain the persona, the choice to defer the desire, the choice to run past the void. These are choices. You are making them, and they are creating the life you experience as given. The courage Rank points toward is not the dramatic kind, not the kind that gets photographed. It is the small, daily, unwitnessed courage of being honest about what is actually happening inside you, of noticing when you have moved away from something real and returning to it without self-punishment, of tolerating the anxiety long enough to hear what it's saying, of wanting the thing you actually want and allowing that wanting to be visible, even when it risks disapproval, even when it disrupts the performance, even when it forces the people around you to deal with a version of you they weren't prepared for. This courage is inconvenient. It does not arrive at a moment when everything else is settled and you have the luxury of self-examination. It is required precisely when things are complicated, when the stakes feel high, when the performance is working and the mask is functioning and everything looks fine from the outside. It is required in the middle of ordinary life, which is to say, it is required constantly, or not at all. Topic 9. The other people in your architecture. No examination of your constructed reality is complete without examining what you have made of the people in it. You have cast them, not consciously, but you have assigned roles, and those roles are remarkably stable. There are people in your life who exist primarily to confirm a specific narrative about yourself. The friend who validates your grievances, the partner who reflects your fears, the family member who proves that certain kinds of love are impossible. You have organized these relationships not around who these people actually are, but around what function they serve in your story. And here is what happens when someone tries to exit the role you've assigned them. When the friend challenges the narrative instead of confirming it. When the partner insists on being seen in a way that disrupts your projections. When the family member simply refuses to perform the expected function. You experience this as a betrayal, as a failure of the relationship, sometimes as evidence that people are fundamentally unreliable. But what it actually is, if you are willing to look at it clearly, is friction between the real person and the role you wrote for them. Rank was interested in the way we use others as mirrors. As external validators for the identity we cannot fully validate internally. We need others to confirm that we are real, that we matter, that the version of ourselves we are performing is convincing and worthy of continued existence. This need is not pathological, it is human. The problem is when the need becomes the entire foundation of the relationship, when you are not actually interested in the other person's experience, but only in what their response to you tells you about yourself. You have been on the other side of this. You have been someone else's mirror. You know the specific quality of being in a relationship where your interior life is genuinely invisible to the other person, where they speak to you, respond to you, react to you, but what they are actually responding to is something they've projected onto you. It is a particular kind of loneliness, a loneliness that is worse than ordinary loneliness because it contains the shape of connection without the substance. Now ask yourself honestly, how often are you doing this to other people? Topic 10. The life that is still possible. There is something Rank understood that most people find almost unbearable when they first encounter it. Individuation is not a destination. It is not a state you achieve and then rest in. It is a continuous, effortful, lifelong practice of choosing yourself, and then choosing yourself again when you've drifted back into the performance. Because you will drift. This is not a failure of will. This is the nature of the work. The constructed self, the persona, the approval architecture, the stories, they are deeply efficient. They run automatically. They require no conscious effort. Whereas authentic existence, the actual, effortful, risky business of being genuinely present in your own life, requires constant recommitment. Every day, in ordinary moments, in the conversations you are having this week, in the choices you are making right now about what to prioritize and what to hide and what to pursue and what to abandon. The question is not whether you are capable of this. The question is whether you believe the effort is worth what it costs. Because it does cost. The persona provides real insulation. The approval architecture provides real comfort. The stories provide real coherence. Dismantling them, not violently, not all at once, but honestly and incrementally, requires you to tolerate a period where the old structure is loosening, but the new one hasn't fully formed yet. And that period is uncomfortable in a way that is difficult to overstate. But here is the alternative. Here is what the other path looks like in 30 years. The performance has become so total that the performer has vanished. The stories have been told so many times that they no longer feel like stories. They feel like the permanent truth of things. The desires have been deferred for so long that you cannot remember what genuine wanting felt like. You are safe, you are maintained, you are functional, and you are entirely absent from your own life. That is not living. That is curating a performance for an audience that will dissolve without a trace, including you. Rank did not offer a resolution. He was too honest for that. What he offered instead was a precise naming of the terror, and within that naming, a strange kind of relief. Not the relief of having solved the problem, but the relief of having finally stopped pretending the problem doesn't exist. You have been aware of most of what this video contained before you watched it. That is the thing about psychological truth. It is rarely new information. It is existing information that you have been managing your distance from, and you will probably continue managing that distance. Some of it. Because full exposure to the depth of your own constructed life is genuinely destabilizing, and the organism prefers stability. But perhaps something here landed differently than before. Perhaps one particular thing, not the whole architecture, but one specific corner of it, is now slightly more visible, slightly harder to ignore. And if that is true, then the question is not what you will do about everything. The question is what you will do about that. The one thing you can no longer quite pretend you didn't see. That question has no comfortable answer, but it might be the most important question you've been avoiding. And you know it.